I think I'm going to talk some about Fusarium mostly, and a little bit about varieties and some of the information that we have relative to Fusarium resistance. And I think most people have heard, in a lot of cases, more than they want to hear about Fusarium. It is one of those things that it's still an issue of a fungal disease that is expanding in terms of the locations in the valley. We have less cotton than we used to, but in terms of distribution of this pathogen, probably 10 years ago it was just in 1 or 2 counties maximum. Now it's really, we've found it in all of the cotton production counties in the San Joaquin Valley. We have been looking elsewhere, not because we were hoping it goes anywhere else, but we've looked in Sacramento Valley. There's people actively looking down in Palo Verde in Arizona, and those locations as well. And I think for better or worse, San Joaquin Valley is the primary, or really the only spot where it's been confirmed, as far as I know at this point. There's a number of handouts that are going to be coming around. Most of the information that I think you need to know, just as sort of the rock bottom basics, are covered in this brochure that's been out for the last couple of years. It's put together by University of California folks in combination with the Cotton Grower Association. So again, if I'm not sure I have enough handouts for everybody here, but even if you get just one of these colored brochures, that pretty much covers most of what I'm going to say anything about. And if anybody else is wanting some additional information, if you just get me a card with either an email address or a mailing address, I'll go ahead and send you copies of whatever handouts I had. Okay, again, this is a fungal organism, and one of the really signature things about Fusarium is whether you're talking about cotton or you're talking about other crops, this produces multiple types of spores that can exist for a very long time period in the soil. It produces conidia, it produces chlamydospores, and the chlamydospores in particular are like this little shielded, nasty spore that can be there in the soil, just waiting basically for a susceptible cotton variety to come along. And they can survive for years, probably decades in the soil. So that's something that's important to keep in mind, is once you identify that you do have race 4 in a field, it's a good thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. It may change some of your choices in terms of production practices. It certainly should change your choices, I think, in terms of varieties. One of the quirks of this particular pathogen, we've been looking at this for about 10 years now, is that the most susceptible varieties are susceptible Pimas, ones like DP744 or Phytogen 830, Phytogen A10R, are highly susceptible. They're kind of like the canary in the mine with this particular type of disease. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind about race 4 Fusarium is any of the people, it's more typical in a few areas of Madera County and down in Kern County. We used to have a lot of race 1 Fusarium that was only seen, really to cause significant damage when it's in combination with root knot nematode. Okay, and one of the things that's distinctly different with race 4 Fusarium is you can really have it in any soil type. It's actually, we have some evidence that it's made even worse when it's in a place where you also have root knot nematode, but it can take off and reproduce and cause economic damage, really in about any soil type with or without root knot nematode. And that's a real significant change. It means that it can be, eventually almost in any of these type of fields. Okay, a couple things to keep in mind, and part of the reason why you see localized spread and maybe longer distance spread of this particular pathogen over time is that these spores can move in soil, they can move in plant debris that's carried from location to location. It hasn't, I don't think, been confirmed with race 4, but with race 1 we know that it can actually survive in gin trash. It can survive in poorly composted materials that really don't get up to a temperature. So it has a lot of different mechanisms potentially for moving around, and that makes it more difficult, particularly when we've got a lot of different possible ways of having something move. One additional thing to keep in mind, again, which is really a hard thing for a water guy like me to say in a water short year, But you can actually move the spores in something with some of the practices that you're probably used to doing to improve your efficiency in irrigation. So some of the fields that we've looked at where people have done touch-up land leveling, with a land plane, if you end up going through an area that has a hot spot of infested ground, and then you run a land plane through there, well, then you can do a pretty nice job of, making your field better for irrigation purposes, but you can also move that pathogen around to a lot of different places in that field. So that's something just to kind of keep in mind once you identify that. And I guess part of the main reason after, all of the experiences with this pathogen of the last 8 or 10 years is still, I think we would certainly recommend, I would certainly recommend that if you see something in your field that looks like it's a match for race 4 Fusarium and you want to know, I think it's really appropriate and kind of important to have it tested. And obviously you can make whatever decisions you want on your own property as to what you do about it. But if you know the pathogen is there, you know you have a hot spot, if you catch it relatively early, you may be able to make some decisions that will at least kind of slow down the spread of the pathogen. And I sort of assert that one of the advantages to trying to do something that would slow down the spread of the pathogen is it takes a while, as you can observe, to come up with resistant varieties. I don't know if we have any phytogen representatives here, but phytogen has had very, very good success in their PIMAs in coming up with what I would say are really highly resistant varieties in the PIMAs. So the grower choices that are out there seem to be expanding. There's some USDA, UC materials that are going to be coming online and made available to the plant breeders as well. But you have choices like Phytogen 800, Phytogen 802 RF, Phytogen 811, DP360, DP358 RF are all PIMAs that actually are among the better ones that we've tested and actually hang in there quite well, even with this pathogen present. One of the handouts that you have is a 4-page handout that's stapled together. On the front page of that, if you just take a quick look at it, I'll point out that at the bottom of the page there's a website that's shown. That's our cotton information website that Brian Marsh maintains for us down in Kern County. And we have variety information on that. We also have Fusarium resistance screening information included on that website. Now, the 4-page handout itself, on the first page, what I did, if you could want to take a look at this sometime later, this is just sort of a subsample of a lot of the screening for race 4 resistance that we did last year. Okay, so if you take a look at those, the two that I circled there show root vascular staining, and the one over on the right-hand side of that first page is plant survival. Okay, and those are probably the easiest ones to look at if you're just trying to run down through there and see in a couple of really hot sites, bad sites for race 4 Fusarium. You can take a look at that and get kind of a summary of how some of the different varieties worked, how they behaved. And the 4-page version of this is basically sorted out to 2 locations where we had commercially available varieties. So there's some PIMAs in there's some hybrids in there's some Kayla upland varieties in there. Okay, if you go to that website, there are also, okay, and then let me back up a little bit. If you go to the website, there is about 16 pages of the same type of information, which covers a whole range of experimentals. And you may want to look at that if you want to have an idea of the kind of progress I think that some of the seed companies in particular are making with some of their experimental materials. There's a lot of things that are looking better every year we do these type of screens. In terms of, I guess, evaluating the fields, I wanted to say a little bit of something about that. Normally, our recommendations would certainly be that it's easier to spot problem areas in the field that you think might be suspicious looking if you do this, say, prior to 12 or 14 leaf, certainly before first bloom. Part of that, I think it's most people's experience, is that you can see further into the field and you can kind of do a crisscross through the field or even look at it, do a pickup survey from the perimeter road, early on you can usually see the rough spots pretty easily, and then you can go out there and decide if you're going to identify if you've got a problem. We've said for years, we recognize that, we've got alkali spots just like we've always had. We have rhizoc problems, we have Phalaeopsis or blackroot, especially down in the South Valley. We've got all kinds of reasons for skips in the field. So not every hole in the field is going to be race 4 Fusarium. You don't need to, assume that. But I do think, it's so much easier to look at these fields this time of the year, or this stage here, or even earlier. Makes it easier to identify areas to kind of zero in on, walk out to, and check. And the other reason to do it early rather than late is that later on in the season, it's going to be more of a common problem to start dealing with issues of verticillium. And it looks a little bit different, but I've been trying to deal with this in screening trials for about the last 10 years or so, and the later in the season you get, the more you get kind of a mix of symptoms that are going on in fields where you have both Fusarium and verticillium present in the same field. So again, the screening and answering the question for you, if you want to know that, answering the question of do you have race 4 Fusarium in the field or not is a whole lot easier to answer pre-bloom. Usually what I've done the last couple of years, I've actually done some of it up in the North Valley, and there may be some people in the audience here that are mad at me for it, but it's so hard to find it when somebody calls you in August and says, I think I've got race 4 in the field, that not only can you not see very far, so you're doing a tremendous amount of walking, but I usually tell guys that call me at that time that I'll only do it if they walk through the field with me. If I show up and they say, okay, well, I'll see you later, let me know what you find, I'm ready to head for my car too. So there's a lot of reasons it's a much more efficient thing to do to look at it early and try to answer that question. And I guess with that in mind, I think speaking for the farm advisors and myself, we will certainly, respond to a call to look at the field, anytime that you want. One other thing Pete Goodell pointed out, I'll mention just real briefly something about the fact that your options for trying to figure out what you have in the field in terms of Fusarium have expanded somewhat as well. The Growers Association and Mike Davis in particular, myself to a smaller degree, worked with a company called Agdia, who have developed a quick test. And I assume most of the people here have probably heard about it. I think there's a handout going around. One of the companies, Nematodes Inc. out of Selma, I think has picked this up. I've also have some experience, and we've been using the quick test with samples that end up coming through me as well. And this is one of these type of tests that works. I guess I'll put my caveats, at least from personal experience, and if anybody wants to say that I'm full of baloney and you've had better or different experience, we'll make sure you have time. My experience with it is that, yes, it's a quick test, and yes, it works. Some of the early information that came out on it indicated that you could use it with leaf tissue, and my experience, at least on medium-sized and smaller plants, is that it doesn't consistently work on leaf tissue. So I still would recommend that you need to be working mostly with stem, or better yet, stem and taproot samples, upper taproot samples. And it's much more consistent in terms of working. I guess part of me being a cheapskate comes out. To me, it's not a cheap test either. It's $30 a sample. So you need to make sure, if you want to do this and you want to get an answer that's correct, not just the answer you'd like to hear. I can go out there and show you how to get an answer that says that you don't have race 4 Fusarium. But if you really want the accurate answer of whether you have it or not, again, I think you need to use root or stem tissue, and you need to be selective in which part of the field you're sampling. You need to identify whether you're in an area where you have root vascular staining, and do all of those kind of tests. And I think then if you have it in your head that you think that's what's going on in the field, then you take a sample, then you have that analyzed, and you won't have to take 20 samples at $30 a piece to confirm what you think is going on in the field. You can take a couple of samples and have them sent in and then get an answer. And I'd certainly, if anybody wants to offer a different opinion, that's just based on what we've seen so far. Okay?
Okay, I can see where a land plane could move it all over. But if it was being moved by cultivators or row equipment, why wouldn't the very first rows of the next field be contaminated? Why is it showing up here, there, in the middle of the field? No pattern at all.
Did everybody hear the question about why there isn't a pattern? Why it doesn't show up right on an edge of a field where you go from field to field if it's coming off of something like cultivation practices? I guess my answer would be that at least I've seen, from an anecdotal standpoint, I've seen lots and lots of locations where about any kind of practice you can think of that would move soil that isn't just super dry, dusty soil, but soil that has a little bit of moisture in it that could have some of the surface spores that are from an infested part of the field.
Are you saying it has to be wet to transmit?
Well, I think it needs to be one of the ways you can kill, especially the canidia of race 4 Fusarium is to expose it to solar radiation and to dehydrate it. And even to some extent, chlamydospores, the real tough resting stage, that type of spore, are still susceptible to gradually being broken down by being exposed to sunlight and conditions that dehydrate them. So moist soil, one, is going to be more likely to stick to cultivation equipment, pickup truck tires, and your shoes and everything else. As one kind of factor, and then also when there's a little bit more moisture in there, it's not going to be quite as nasty an environment. It'll hold a clod a little better, and so the spores will be internal instead of on the outside part. So I've had people say, well, so when we have all this wind, are you moving spores? Probably the answer is some. If somebody sees a dust devil go through a field, can that move race 4 Fusarium spores? The answer is probably, yes. But I don't think that's a major mode of transmission from field to field. My feeling in a lot of the fields, and I'll just go ahead and name a county, Fresno County, I think in a lot of the fields, a lot of the movement, field-to-field movement happened not when they were growing cotton in those fields, but when they were growing another crop like lettuce or broccoli or tomatoes, where you have wet soil produced because of the type of operations they do in those fields. So when you're rotating from crop to crop, if you think about it, a lot of the operations that are done in cotton fields are pretty much dry soil operations, and unless you're unlucky enough to get caught with fall rains, I'd say that most of the harvest equipment is actually relatively clean and not going to be moving a tremendous amount. But I'm positive that in a lot of the fields where I've seen field-to-field spread and even farm-to-farm spread, the types of practices that are going on where you come out of a field and you have equipment that's dropping mud out of an infested field into a road, which then can be picked up by every type of equipment that goes through there, including pickup trucks, is a heck of a way to move this type of a pathogen from field to field. And it can come out onto a common road from your farm, and you could be going, knocking yourself out in terms of containment practices. When you come out onto a common road, if your next door neighbor is doing something completely different and you're sharing that road, then when you make your turns and you head back into the field, then that's definitely a way that it can be spread. It can survive in tailwater. If tailwater is moved field to field, the caveat I'd make on that also is that I don't think it's a huge way that the pathogen is spread, but especially if you have tailwater where you can see that there's a lot of suspended soil, because it's moved real aggressively. The volume is high or something, or it's moving on a pretty good slope. If you can see a lot of suspended soil in tailwater, then that certainly is one way that you can introduce it. And I've seen, a number of locations around the valley where the point of introduction to a field will be water coming out of a sump that came off of other fields where there was infection essentially upstream. The other part that, it doesn't make anybody feel any better, but, we say in this brochure, and we've known for probably about 3 years now, that it is potentially a seed-borne disease. So there's no question that certainly, at least early on, if you saw a spot right out smack in the middle of the field, that could have started as one infected seed that hit the ground and gave you a starting point for the pathogen. And the life cycle and the way this pathogen works is if you see a big area with lots of dead plants, you confirm it's race 4 Fusarium, and you see a pretty good sized patch, maybe there's only 30% stand loss in an area that's half an acre. But if it's that kind of a size, a swimming pool size or something like that or bigger, there's almost no chance that is the first year that was introduced. That's probably been there for 2 or 3 years. And, I'm routinely in fields where somebody will say, well, I had tomatoes in here last year, or I had small grains in here last year. That really doesn't matter. I mean, it was introduced several years back, and it could be as long ago as 4 or 5, 6 years ago. We do have locations, for instance, when the cotton prices went up so nicely a couple years ago, we had some fields that went back into cotton that had been out of cotton for probably 5 or 6 years. And first year back in cotton, in the fields where they grew, quite susceptible varieties, we saw and got calls to come out and check them for race 4 Fusarium, and they were confirmed. So again, it goes along with the whole idea that these spores can last for a long time. I do think that the seed industry is, trying really hard in combination with the university, in combination with the Crop Improvement Association. Their field inspections are much more aggressive than what they were 5 or 6 years ago. The more we've learned about this, and since we've confirmed that you can have seed-borne race 4 FOB, all of these fields are getting very aggressive inspections if they're seed production fields, and there's a fair number, in recent years that have been rejected for a find of race 4 Fusarium confirmed in any part of a seed field. So again, this all kind of ramped up. The more information we got, the more awareness there was of possible ways of moving this around. The more we've learned. So. Again, usually, my feeling is that the only reason to be kind of persistent about saying that it's good to look for this relatively early on is then it's sort of hopefully more your choice to decide whether you want to rotate out to a different crop to cut down on your economic losses and reduce the spread or the production of new inoculum for the disease. And it's also, at least would be our recommendation that it'll reduce your chances of having even worse economic loss. And so, my feeling is if you get a confirmed race 4 Fusarium, the more widespread it is in the field, the more I would say you want to plant a resistant variety if you want to plant cotton in that field. You can't really go back to planting the highly susceptible varieties without the risk of just really losing your shorts on that field. And we've seen fields multiple years, I'm sorry to say, that have, including a lot of uplands. We used to think that the Pimas were the worst affected, but we have populations of inoculum that have reached levels where we can see significant damage in uplands as well. And a lot of the Acalas, like Phytogen 725 RF and Phytogen 72 and Daytona, are all in the moderately susceptible group. And so I've seen fields this year in multiple places in the valley where we probably have 50 to 70% stand loss in Acala fields. And so don't let anybody tell you that it can only hit Pima or that it can only expand in locations where you grow Pima, because that hasn't been our experience. So there any, the only other thing I guess I would say, other than that they should put me on at the beginning of the program so everybody can forget what I say during the course of the talk. These are kind of depressing talks for me too, but the other part is we don't yet know of great rotations in terms of crop rotations that seriously reduce the survival of the inoculum. The inoculum levels will decline. The longer you're out of cotton, the longer you're out of susceptible varieties of cotton, the inoculum levels will decline. If you grow resistant varieties of cotton, the inoculum levels will decline and also over time and not expand. None of the resistant varieties are a total miracle cure. So if you ramp up a field and you grow this and develop such a huge level of race 4 inoculum that, say you have a complete wipeout with a moderately susceptible variety like one of the Acalas, okay, you don't want to go the next year then into the most resistant Pimas, for instance, because again, you're putting a heck of a pressure on that plant. Be better off to go plant small grains or tomatoes or do something else for at least a year before you'd go back in, because you're just putting too much of a challenge on that plant. So
that's it. You think a year or 2 years helps? What's
yeah, I mean, yes, yeah, a year or 2 years does help, and the one that is easier to say on a year, on a rotten year like this one with our water situation, we have a number of locations that we've kind of tried to monitor over the years, where in the Westlands where they've run out of water, and so they had summer fallow, so they had essentially relatively weed-free summer fallow. And that probably reduced inoculum survival more than anything else did. And part of that, again, is this is one heck of a persistent pathogen. It's sort of the cockroach of fungal diseases. I mean, it'll hang around through a lot. And what it does is it'll survive as a saprophyte on roots of a whole bunch of other plants that it won't infect, including weeds. So if you do a fallow type of approach, you don't want a weedy fallow field because it'll hang in there on the roots of the weeds. Okay, and one last thing, again, there certainly are some options for chemical management, most of which are probably more expensive than what you want to do for cotton ground. We've had people who've used Vapam plus solarization, Telone 2. In research trials, we've even done methylbromide and chloropicrin, like what you'd use for strawberries. And methylbromide and chloropicrin work pretty nicely, probably still not perfect, but maybe about a 98% kill in the treated zone, but at about whatever it is now, $2,000 an acre. So, for practical purposes, Vapam actually has worked quite well in a number of studies that have been done, largely by the USDA folks when they were down in the Shafter area. And Vapam in combination with solarization works pretty well. And I guess the only thing I would say is that if you catch something fairly early, and you want to do a treatment in a hotspot area the first year, that may make some pretty good sense as a possibility. Once it starts getting dragged around the field and becomes more widespread and everything again, you could still do that type of treatment as long as the next combination you put out there is a resistant cotton variety. Okay?
One more question.
Yep.
How about years when their salt is coming up because we didn't have a lot of rain and the salts come up? Does that make it more susceptible if it has, that and the race 4 in?
Yeah, if everybody heard the question is about whether or not salinity levels would make it even worse. And I guess I would say that actually about anything that represents what happens. Generally this is a fungal disease that infects the roots at a very early growth stage. So it doesn't hit the plant late in development, it hits it really, really early. So about anything that reduces that damages the root system a lot is likely to make it somewhat worse. So you can see that with compaction, you can see it with some issues with Treflan application that would do some root pruning. You can take it the other way around. If somebody says, I know a lot of people who have tried materials that, humic acids or other materials that they think have some root promoting characteristics, and I certainly wouldn't discount that under some circumstances those would be helpful. Because again, one of the biggest problems that plants have in the case of something like Fusarium is that they have a severely damaged root system. And so again, something that helps promote a little healthier situation for the roots, they may beat it out. And when we do a lot of our screenings, it's kind of interesting to me at least, one of the things that you'll see is plants that don't get infected sometimes out of a population of plants. You can take a look at them real closely and they'll have been infected on a lateral root coming off of the taproot, and the lateral root will be dead. The staining that you see in the root tissue isn't actually the pathogen, it's the plant essentially walling off that part of the tissue to try to prevent the spread of the pathogen. So if you look at it, in some of these plants that hang in there and don't end up getting infected, a persistent infection, they'll just wall off that lateral root, the lateral root will die, and then you'll see a brown spot right at the point of connection with the taproot. Then the rest of the plant will be fine, and it basically just sort of fought it off. So again, resistant varieties to me is the most persistent, message. I think choices about containment practices and everything are, kind of a personal thing. With the rotation of crops that a lot of people have, I realize that, some of these things are not practical, for a lot of other operations, especially in some of your other crops. But, to me, I think you want to know if you think you have this, it's a good thing to know if you want to keep going on as a cotton grower. Because there are some options in terms of resistant varieties that would, definitely save you money going forward in the future and prevent some of these economic losses. And the good thing is there's a substantial amount of effort underway with the seed companies in looking for resistance. Part of it is a self-preservation thing for the cotton industry, is, if I can say a semi-political comment, is I think they're worried about this expanding into other areas of the United States. So the seed companies are taking this very seriously, and they all, like Phytogen Dow, have a big breeding effort looking for resistant varieties, including uplands. Bayer has a fairly aggressive program as well. And to us that are in the UC community, we're working still with Mauricio Ulloa, who's a USDA breeder. When they closed out the Shafter program, they actually transferred him to Lubbock, Texas, but still about a third of his job is to continue work on race 4 Fusarium and breeding and screening efforts. So he's working both on conventional breeding as well as transgenic work, and he's working with Steve Wright and myself and others here still in California. So again, I think even though our acreage is down and everything, I think there's actually a lot of resources going into looking at even more resistant varieties being available. And anything we can do to either answer questions, or if you have field visit requests or something, you can contact me or contact your farm advisor, and we'll try to work with you. Okay, and hopefully somebody has something more uplifting and positive. Like I said, the resistance part is good news with the resistant varieties.
Sorry, we could have clipped that.